And every time you tell a lie, you take a chance. You risk somebody doing what I did, going and checking and seeing and discovering that he isn't quoting them accurately. You take a risk. Why would you take that risk when you don't have any compensating benefit?
Today is Friday, February 5th. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I'm your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Well, thank you for tuning in from wherever you happen to be listening. My name is Jules Taylor, and this is No Easy Answers, and I'm very excited to bring you a conversation that I had recently with Dr. Grover Furr. Now, Dr. Furr is the author of several books and articles on Soviet history, specifically the Stalin era of 1930 to 1953. I wanted to talk with him because every single one of his publications stand in contradiction to the generally accepted narratives of Soviet history. If you ask a random person who Joseph Stalin is, they'll probably tell you something like Stalin was a brutal dictator and he killed millions of people. Books by historians Stephen Kotkin and Robert Conquest affirm these accusations of crimes and atrocities, and so people generally believe the standard line about Stalin. Of course, all of this works in service of framing the USSR as totalitarian, and more broadly permits the positing of the false notion of horseshoe theory. As you'll hear in our conversation, Dr. Furr has spent years combing through the footnotes of authors like Kotkin and Conquest. He's not only refuting their accusations, but he's publishing books showing why their accusations are false with primary source evidence. His work is remarkable when you begin to think of the ways that 20th century world history would change if we had to fundamentally rethink the history of Soviet Russia. It really was an honor and a privilege to speak with Dr. Furr about his research and his latest publication, Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy. So here's my conversation with Dr. Grover Furr. Welcome to No Easy Answers. Thank you for accepting my invitation. It's an honor to have you, Dr. Furr, and I really appreciate you having this conversation with me. Before we launch into a greater discussion about your books and your work and your research, I wonder if we might take a moment to learn a bit about, more about you as a person. You're a professor of English specializing in medieval literature, and you've published a number of books and articles on Soviet history during the Stalin era. So I can only surmise that your interest in Soviet history came from within a context of your own political development. But would you be able to speak to maybe a little bit about your journey to reach this point and where and when you felt the initial spark of interest in Soviet history?
Yes, certainly. By the way, in my latest book, which I co-authored with two independent scholars, Vladimir Bobrov and Sven-Erik Holmstrom, and this is Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy. There's a section beginning on page 15 called My Road to the Tukuchevsky Affair, and it more or less outlines the answer to the question that you just
great.
asked. But I'll go over it, briefly, sure. When I was a graduate student, a little bit when I was an undergraduate, it mainly happened when I was a graduate student, I was opposed to the war in Vietnam. This is the 1960s, okay, the latter half of the 1960s. And at one point, I was at a demonstration in New York City, and I was more watching the demonstration at that point than participating. And a gentleman behind me said to me and my friend, in a not a hostile manner, that we really shouldn't oppose the war in Vietnam because the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, which was the so-called Viet Cong, who were fighting, at that point, the majority of the fighting against the United States and the South Vietnamese Army. The National Liberation Front was led by the Communist Party of Vietnam, which I knew. The Communist Party of Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had been trained in the 1920s, I think he said, by Joseph Stalin, and Stalin had killed 20 million people. So, yeah, that's what he said. So I didn't believe it. I didn't not believe it. I just sort of filed it away. And I told myself that at some point I need to look into this. Meanwhile, I was going to graduate school in medieval studies, and that's an important part of the picture, which we'll get to in a second. After I got out of graduate school and started teaching here at Montclair State, I didn't have my doctoral dissertation finished yet. I read the book by Robert Conquest called The Great Terror. Now, this book had come out in 1968, but I was busy, studying, starting my dissertation, passing exams, being active in the anti-war movement, all kinds of other things. I didn't read this big fat book until the early 70s, but it's full of very, very serious accusations of crimes by Stalin, mass murder, stuff like this.
Sure.
So I determined that when I had some time, I'd look into this a little bit. And after I got a little bit more experience and more work on my dissertation under my belt in the middle 70s, I started to do that. I started to go to the Slavic room of the New York Public Library. I could take the bus from near where I lived and check the footnotes in Conquest's book. Now I just want to pause over this issue of evidence. I had learned about evidence in graduate school, studying medieval literature, what constitutes evidence. And of course, if you read, mystery novels, you read Sherlock Holmes stories, you get a kind of general rough and ready idea of what constitutes evidence and what doesn't. But what I discovered in studying Conquest's book, which was very famous and published in zillions of copies, of course, he worked for the British equivalent of the CIA. That was known even at that time, but he was a very famous guy. And he was at the Hoover Institution. He published lots of books. This is Robert Conquest. He was not a figure who was particularly criticized by the professionals in the field of Soviet history. But what I discovered is he didn't have any evidence for any of his statements, any of them. He cited other people. He cited books that said what he said, that repeated these charges. But of course, that's not evidence. Just because person A agrees with person B doesn't mean that person A and B are correct, right? It just means they agree with each other.
Right.
So I spent a long time and a lot of effort checking over that book. And I decided that at some point that I would try to do some writing on this once I finished my doctoral dissertation. And I did, and eventually, after a certain process went through, in the middle to late 1980s, I got an article published on the military purges, the same subject that is that of our recent book, right? Trotsky and the Tukuchevsky, Trotsky and the military purges. Okay, so the process was that I submitted this article to the editors, and these were young guys, and they bounced it around, and they asked me to revise it, and I revised it 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times, but eventually these younger editors said, okay, it's ready for publication. They submitted it to the publisher. Now, this was a journal that at that point was run by, I think it was Arizona State University, but it had a private publisher. And the publisher rejected my article. And he rejected it on the grounds that it made Stalin look good. Now, if you read that article, it's on my webpage. It doesn't make Stalin look good. What it says is we don't have the evidence that Stalin framed these military figures, and that a couple of the articles that said they did have the evidence were incorrect. We don't have the evidence. So that was my first, as you might say, introduction to the whole concept of the anti-Stalin paradigm, although I didn't call it that at that time. I just thought it was something strange about this one guy. Charles Schlocks is his name. And, to the credit of my editors, who are the junior figures here, the major figure being a guy named Arch Getty, who later became a very well-known scholar of Soviet history, and at that time was a junior faculty member. He insisted, and he went so far as to say that if the publisher didn't publish my article, then these editors were going to resign because, it had passed, my article had passed muster with them, and that's that. So they were victorious, and the article was published. But interestingly, that issue of the journal, which is called Russian History, and it's still published, it's still available, this journal, that issue had an introduction. And the introduction had a paragraph about each article in that volume, except mine. My article, which was printed there, was simply not mentioned in the introduction. Now, clearly, it was even clear to me at that time that whoever wrote this introduction didn't want to say anything positive about my article. If he said anything negative about it, then the question would be, why are you publishing it at all? So he didn't say anything. So it sort of stands out. Once you notice that, you think, wow, that's kind of interesting. And that's my first experience with what I later came to call the anti-Stalin paradigm. So, later on, the internet came along, the World Wide Web popped into existence, and I put a number of my published articles on the web, and I retyped that article. We didn't have scanners and so forth. This is the middle of the 90s. And I put it on my webpage. And then I was contacted in 1999 by a gentleman who has now been my colleague in research for over 21 years, Vladimir Bobrov of Moscow. And he said, your article is the best article on the Tukuchevsky affair, but there's been a lot of documents that have come out of the Soviet archives since the end of the Soviet Union, and your article doesn't reflect any of that. Well, of course not. It was written in the 1980s. He said, so I would like to help you, work with the Soviet archives and work on the Tukuchevsky business. So I started to do that in conjunction with Vladimir. And after a couple of years, I came to realize something, which is that this is an area that I could make some sort of contribution in. Medieval literature is interesting, but it is important to a very, very small number of people. Articles and books in medieval literature are read by a very small group of people around the world. And this topic, Soviet history, is quite different. Lots and lots of people are interested in it. And one of the most interesting things about it is that the acknowledged experts, the legitimated specialists, mainly academics in this field, are very much like Conquest. They don't have much respect for evidence.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton there, and I'm especially curious about what your working relationship is like with Vladimir Bobrov, and I've seen you mention his name in several of your works. So this seems like it was the first time that you've encountered what you refer to as the anti-Stalin paradigm. I'm curious as to, because that was your first time. When did you start referring to it as the anti-Stalin paradigm?
My first book which was first published in Russian and translated by Vladimir, in English called Khrushchev Lied. So the English version came out, I think it was February 2011, exactly 10 months ago, the end of February here, 10 years ago. It came out in December 2008 in Russia, and it caused a bit of a stir. So in that book is organized in a kind of unusual way, I guess you'd say. I did that. I explain in the introduction that I did that because I just had to use I had to put in an awful lot of evidence. And the reason was, here I'm announcing my discovery that this speech, Khrushchev's famous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on February 25th, 1956, at this very famous speech, Khrushchev basically lied from one end of it to the other. I knew that would seem outrageous to many people for various reasons. And I say this in the introduction. I said, I know this is going to seem like a kind of boring and tedious way to deal with this subject, but I just feel I have to put in all of this evidence because people are just not going to accept my word for this. They're going to demand the evidence, and frankly, I don't think that even my putting in the evidence is going to do it, because it threatens to overturn, not only the history of the Soviet Union in the 20th century, but a good deal of 20th century history far beyond the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's speech was the most influential speech of the 20th century, maybe in terms of its actual material effects, maybe the most influential speech in human history. Not because it was a speech, not just stirring people up or giving people a sense of purpose or hope. It wasn't a pep talk like Churchill's speeches during World War II. It wasn't a commemoration like Lincoln's speech. It led to a large number of changes in world history. And it had been taken as primary source evidence. That is to say, researchers, not only in the Soviet Union, but the anti-communist researchers outside the Soviet Union simply said, well, this is the truth. And we can always quote Khrushchev, and Khrushchev's telling the truth. Well, of course, they didn't know that. They didn't know he was telling the truth. They just assumed he was telling the truth. Why assume that?
Right.
Why assume? And I, of course, had the experience some decades before of studying Conquest's book. Conquest was saying he was drawing on Khrushchev and Khrushchev era stuff, and treating it all as though it was correct. Anytime he found an anti-Stalin statement, and he found in any sort of source, whether Russian or otherwise, a statement claiming that Stalin had done something bad, he just put it in his book, and as though that was evidence that it had happened. I studied medieval literature. I know that that's not the case. That's not evidence. But in the field of Soviet history, there's a lot of respect for evidence when it comes to the Stalin period and the figure of Stalin himself. So that's I would say the major problem I run across. It's the major stumbling block that many people have in understanding Soviet history, and it's kind of perhaps my major message in all of my articles and books is evidence. Evidence on the one hand, insist on evidence and don't accept anything less. And primary source evidence is the only kind of valid evidence. And the second thing is the issue of objectivity. And I write about those in everything that I write.
Well, you point out 61 different assertions made by Khrushchev in his secret speech. Mm-hmm. And I think in your introduction, or I'm not sure where I heard this, but aside from maybe like one small caveat in there.
Mhm.
You have found and assert that 61 different assertions are actually outright lies. Hence the title of your book, Khrushchev's Lies. And, I've heard you in different interviews mention the importance of this speech. But I'm wondering if maybe you might be able to spell out for listeners like what the implications are for world history if this speech and its so-called truth is overturned.
Well, the speech is important in of itself, and in the implications, once you recognize that Khrushchev is lying in this speech, the implications of that are tremendous because between 56, when he gave this speech, and October 64, when he was ousted from being the first secretary, leader of the party, Khrushchev sponsored a very, very large number of what I would today call pseudo-historical works on the Stalin period, virtually all of which were and still are accepted as truthful by Western scholars and, of course, also now in Russian, by anti-communists and by Trotskyists. They're just accepted as true. And none of them contained any evidence, period. They just didn't. And they don't. So, what's the significance is, well, first of all, it has tremendous significance for Soviet history. Why did Khrushchev feel he had to lie? Well, one obvious issue is certainly if Khrushchev had found any real crimes of Stalin, he'd have stuck them in there, right? Or maybe have some lies, but we're going to stick in some truthful stuff too. But he didn't. That the implication is he couldn't. And so what does that mean? They looked high and low for evidence of crimes of Stalin, and they couldn't find any. And that continued throughout the Khrushchev years. He sponsored some other studies, which the results of which were not published until after the end of the Soviet Union. But he sponsored some other studies, and clearly the people who carried those out on his behalf were charged with finding evidence to support some crimes of Stalin, to support the innocence of people that Khrushchev wanted to declare innocent, like these military conspirators, Tukuchevsky and others. And they were unable to do it. And I analyzed some of that stuff and some of those documents in some of my books, including the most recent book. They weren't able to do it. So they couldn't find any. And then skip through the Gorbachev, Chernenko, skip through the Brezhnev, Chernenko, period, Andropov period, and leap up to Gorbachev. And Gorbachev mounted an even more strident campaign of anti-Stalin fact claims in the last 4 years of the existence of the Soviet Union. Really a massive campaign of what we can now prove were all falsehoods. And of course, he picked up Khrushchev's lies and the Khrushchev era lies, and he repeated them. And then he had others fabricate yet more lies. So all of this stuff was avidly picked up by the Western anti-communists, Eastern anti-communists, Trotskyists everywhere, and repeated over and over again, and still is. And so this incredibly important period of 20th century history, the history of the Soviet Union, has been distorted beyond the ability of most people to accept it. We don't know the history of the Stalin period, although many, many books and articles will claim that we know it, but we don't, because they simply repeat these falsehoods. And what that means is we don't really understand important parts of world history of the 20th century, because there's a real sense in which the 20th century was the Soviet century. After the Russian Revolution, until the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, almost everything of a certain scale in world politics, all throughout almost virtually every country in the world, was impacted by the influence of the Russian Revolution and the Communist International and the example of the Soviet Union, particularly during the Stalin period, but afterwards as well. So our understanding of world history in the 20th century is seriously undermined and seriously inaccurate because of the falsehoods about the Stalin period, the Soviet Union.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a lot to take in. I mean, if we have to fundamentally rethink Soviet history, I mean, I agree with you that, there's a lot of world history that was directly impacted in all facets by Soviet history. And so, I've always felt like history was kind of humanity's collective inheritance, and we have to guard history and make sure that we know our history, and that we also have to take care to, make sure the well isn't poisoned by bad faith actors. And it sounds like what you've discovered over the course of your career is a large amount of falsehoods and I wanted to ask you about your personal motivations for this sort of thing, but it seems like it's not so much like a personal ideological motivation as much as it's a desire and passion for historical veracity. And so, I'm a big fan of your work for that reason. It's one thing to be I think that there's a very hurtful and damaging sort of aura of conspiratorial thinking within the United States. But it's another thing when you go back and you actually look at primary source evidence and you discover this and you're kind of yelling in the dark about it. And so so that's part of the reason why I wanted to interview you, is that you spent a tremendous amount of time discrediting and finding obvious sort of holes in the narratives of many of these books. So before I had even heard of your work, I was given a copy of a book by Stephen Kotkin called Waiting for Hitler. And this thing is like, it's a doorstop, it's 1,200 pages long. And to tell you the truth, I barely opened it. And at the time, I wanted to look through this and look through some of the footnotes myself to see where this evidence is, because just like as you've described, it's a lot of people agreeing with each other, but not a lot of actual primary source evidence. So I'm wondering, can you tell us about the process of your writing Stalin, Waiting for the Truth? Because I'm especially curious how long it took you to painstakingly research all of Kotkin's footnotes, and if you had or what your working relationship was like with your friend in Moscow, Vladimir Bobrov, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Vladimir Bobrov, during the course of your writing that book.
Sure. Well, I started using the term the Anti-Stalin Paradigm in the subtitle of my second book, which is about the murder of Sergei Kirov. That's where I finally decided, I had to put a name to this phenomenon. And the way the Anti-Stalin Paradigm, I'm going to get to your question, but the way the Anti-Stalin Paradigm works, if anybody accuses Stalin of a crime, it's considered taboo, not just bad taste, but just really, it's not done, to declare that Stalin is not guilty of that crime. Okay, it's not considered bad taste to talk about evidence if the evidence tends to show that some claim that Stalin committed some crime is false. You're just not supposed to do that. What's wrong with you? And I've experienced that personally many times. Okay, when I wrote my, I guess it was the third book of Blood Lies, where I went through and studied the sources and the claims of crimes of Stalin and the Soviets made by Yale professor Timothy Snyder in his book Bloodlands, between Hitler and Stalin, and showed in that book that it's basically falsehoods from beginning to end. I wrote, I have a last couple of chapters about how poorly, how really how dishonestly the academic community dealt with this. You know, that book got a lot of positive reviews by people who had no business at all reviewing it, and a couple of positive reviews by people who could have reviewed it in an honest way, but chose not to do that. But chose not to check up any of the statements, just to accept them. He must be telling the truth, therefore it's a wonderful book. Word got back, I've been reliably informed, to Timothy Snyder at Yale about my book, and his response was interesting. I've seen it quoted. He said, "Oh, well, you know, Furr, he's a Stalinist."
Right.
Well, you see how that works. Once you declare somebody a Stalinist, you don't have to pay any attention to the evidence that they cite. Okay, it's called an ad hominem attack, and everyone
Right.
should know that that is a logical fallacy. It's a way of dodging the issue. It's a very, very well known error in informal logic to attack the person instead of the argument. And that's what he said. Oh, he's a Stalinist. So I get called a Stalinist a lot, as though I am being dishonest in trying to absolve Stalin of various crimes. And I think that shows a couple of things. Number one, people who themselves are being dishonest with evidence tend to assume that everybody else is also dishonest with evidence. So people like Snyder, like Kotkin, certainly very dishonest with their evidence, tend to assume, and many others, tend to assume that, well, everybody else is dishonest too, so why shouldn't I be dishonest? Well, if he disagrees with me, he's being biased. He's a pro-Stalin guy trying to absolve Stalin.
Right.
And of course, that's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is investigating all of the fact claims that I can find, the claims that Stalin committed some crime or other. Every time I have found a claim that Stalin committed some crime, I try to go out there and research it. Starting with Khrushchev's secret speech, as you say, he alleged 61 crimes, either by Stalin or by Beria. And then I continued after that. And I write about objectivity, the importance of questioning your own preconceived ideas and not falling prey to the bias of simply confirming what you already think. It's called confirmation bias.
Right.
Again, error in formal logic is to cherry pick the evidence that tends to support your preconceived idea. And of course, you'll never discover the truth that way. But that's what happens in the field of Soviet studies. Okay. And I don't do that. But I'm always accused of doing that by those who do it. Because it is taboo to say that Stalin did not commit the crimes of which he has been charged. So that's an important issue. Now, as for how to go about this, in the case of Kotkin's book, it took quite a long time. Kotkin's book has, I think I counted it, over 5,200 footnotes. Not every single one of those footnotes is a footnote to an alleged crime of Stalin. Sometimes it's just a footnote to a well-acknowledged fact, like the 17th Party Congress happened in January 1934, something like that.
Right.
But hundreds and hundreds of them are footnotes that are there to supposedly document the crimes that Stalin committed as alleged by Kotkin. And I investigated each and every one of them. Many of them are from Russian sources, actually most of them, and many of them are from from former Soviet archives. And I've been doing this for a number of years, and I know pretty well how to do it, and I know reasonably well what's available, what's out there. It was easier for me to, then I read Russian well, so it was easier for me to do this, after having already done it for 9 or 10 years. than it would be for someone else, maybe it's just starting out. But it still took me a better part of 2 years to do it. And I wrote that book kind of out of a sense of indignation, and that's true of a lot of the stuff that I read. Maybe most of the scholarship that I do. I'm just affronted by the dishonesty in the field of Soviet history. As a historian, as somebody who's trying to discover the truth, it shocks and offends me that in this field, in the Soviet history of the Stalin period, so little of that goes on. And certainly in the larger sense, that is to say that the larger framework of Soviet history is poisoned by it. There is some good work in Soviet history on very specific topics, which can be easily fitted into an anti-Stalin paradigm. But the idea that this paradigm is fundamentally false is never questioned. An example: a month or so ago, I read a review in the H. Diplo scholarly email list of a book about 20th century history, and it was written by a well-known Soviet scholar of the Soviet Union, and he said, "Well, the brutal dictator Stalin." He just refers to the brutal dictator Stalin. Well, Stalin was not only not brutal, but he wasn't a dictator. One of these days, I'm going to write an article about all the evidence that Stalin was not a dictator, but he wasn't. And no matter how you define it, you can look it up in all the dictionaries and so forth. Stalin wasn't a dictator, and he wasn't brutal. But you're not supposed to say that. So you can just say the brutal dictator Stalin. You don't need a footnote, But if you wanted to say, well, Stalin wasn't brutal or Stalin wasn't a dictator, then you need a lot of footnotes. And even then, no one is going to accept what you have to say. So I spent a lot of time checking up Kotkin's sources, and it's a travesty. It's shameful. And if you've read my book, Stalin Waiting for the Truth, or just the introduction to it, which I put online when I published the book, as a kind of come on, you'll see that I just am offended by the dishonesty of this work. I mean, unlike Timothy Snyder, who's not really a scholar of the Soviet Union, he's an Eastern Europeanist in Poland, Ukraine, maybe, but not the Soviet Union. So he writes a book about Stalin. He really doesn't know what he's talking about. But Kotkin is probably the world's expert on Stalin. And he has a absolutely worldwide reputation and worldwide audience. And the idea that he's falsifying every allegation of crime, or even mean-spiritedness, even minor stuff, there's no evidence for it. And there's lots of evidence against most. Is something that that most people are simply not prepared to accept. So it's easier to think there's something wrong with Grover Furr than to think there's something fundamentally wrong with the way we look at the history of the Soviet Union, and as a result, at the history of the 20th century. Okay, that's a big problem. That's a big issue. Let's not go there. That's very upsetting. The problem is Furr. There's something kooky about him, and we can just ignore him. So we'll call him a Stalinist, and then we can just sort of, not pay any attention to what he says. That's what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a particularly dangerous field to investigate. Short of like ad hominem attacks or something like that. I mean, there's real things, that could happen to you in that respect. You could be isolated severely for what you're putting out there. And and also, I guess, look, as a podcast host that's trying to platform and speak to things that don't have an easy answer. Part of what concerned me in talking to you was that I feel like with all the, I'll call them lies, maybe falsehoods, it's with all these things that circulate out there during the course of questioning any of this stuff, it seems like we're always maybe like a footstep away from something like genocide denial or something like and I read up in Wikipedia about Holodomor.
Yeah.
And the first entry in that, it talks about it as if it's a thing that happened and all that, and then at the very bottom it says, hey, historians agree as to whether or not this is a real thing. So even that seems like it's not entirely truthful, that they wait till the very end of the Wikipedia page to detail that. And of course people blame Stalin for that. People blame him for naturally occurring, droughts that cause a famine. So there's a lot out there that way. And I just want to commend you for the work that you've done. And I think that maybe how you're able to avoid, or as much as it is possible to avoid, being isolated or being called a revisionist or what have you, you've got to stick to the evidence that way. And so adhering to that evidence and presenting that evidence in an easily digestible form, I mean, your book, Waiting for the Truth, Stalin Waiting for the Truth, is considerably smaller and more accessible and digestible than any of Kotkin's work.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your other book, Trotsky's Lies. I want to also get to your most recent book, which, by the way, congratulations on that. And before we get there, I want to talk to you about your book, Trotsky's Lies, because you mentioned there have been several primary historical sources that have been made available for the first time, but that no one has previously written on Trotsky. No one that's previously written on Trotsky has made use of these sources. So you contend that these sources are important and they permit us to know more about Trotsky's activities in the 1930s than ever before. Can you maybe give us one or two examples of how new primary sources are contradicting previously held notions? And how did your relationship with Vladimir Bobrov assist you in writing this work?
Okay, that's two questions.
Yes.
Let me start with Trotsky. Okay, so my book, Trotsky's Lies, is really, I would say, about a third to a half of an earlier book called Trotsky's Amalgams. I wrote a book called Trotsky's Amalgams back in 2016, something like that, 2015. It's well over 500 pages long. And what I discovered after writing that book, I think it's a good book, but what I discovered is that very few people will buy 500-page books. And of the people who buy them, very few of them will read the 500 pages. And then of those few who do read them, by the time they've finished the book, they've forgotten what's at the beginning of the book. So I decided not to write any more 500-page books or even 400-page books. Try to keep it shorter. So I divided Trotsky's Amalgams up into 3 smaller books to be more bite-sized, so to speak. And Trotsky's Lies is one of them. In Trotsky's Lies, and in the same section of Trotsky's Amalgams, the earlier work, I discussed really 2 kinds of sources. One is some materials from the Trotsky archive at Harvard, which was open to researchers in January 1980. And so it's not a Soviet archive, right? It's Trotsky's archive that he sold to Harvard University, and he said it shouldn't be open until 40 years after my death. He was killed in August 1940, but Harvard interpreted 40 years after my death to mean essentially the beginning of 1980. And some interesting stuff was discovered there. And then that's part of it. And the other part of it is in his writings, in Trotsky's writings, and mainly in the 1930s, but also to some extent in the 1920s, he used, or he referred to some sources that he said he was drawing upon for these writings, that these works that he was writing. And some of those are obtainable. some of the newspapers that Trotsky said he was summarizing and said he was discussing in his writings. These are obtainable. They're 1930s type publications. So I went back and got those publications, and I checked to see if Trotsky was summarizing the facts stated in those publications correctly. What I found out is he was lying about the articles that he said he was drawing upon, for some of these articles that he was writing in the 1980s. He was using the French Communist Party newspaper, L'Humanité. He was using Pravda, the Soviet newspaper, one or two other sources. And I found that he was simply lying about what they said. And that therefore anybody back in the 1930s, anybody since Trotsky wrote, anybody since the 1930s could have gone back and done what I did. These were not secret documents locked up in an archive somewhere.
Wow.
Public stuff. And either nobody had ever done it, or at least nobody had ever published about it. Interestingly enough, the Trotskyists had never done it. You'd think they would be motivated because they admire this guy.
Right.
Go out there and document, check up and document everything he was saying, but they had never done it. So you can prove that Trotsky was lying, not solely by checking what he had to say against, former Soviet documents from former Soviet archives, but just by reading the same materials that Trotsky was referring to and seeing that he lied about and distorted what those materials were saying. So Trotsky lied. So what I discovered was that Trotsky lied a lot.
Right.
He lied when there was, as I point out in that book, he lied when for the life of me, I can't figure out that he had any reason to do it. And every time you tell a lie, you take a chance. You risk somebody doing what I did, going and checking and seeing if he's quoting these newspapers, let's say, accurately, and discovering that he isn't quoting them accurately. You take a risk. Why would you take that risk when you don't have any compensating benefit? But in a couple of cases, that's exactly what I discovered that he did. So Trotsky just lied a lot. He's somebody who really, it's true, you can never do that with anybody. You should check everything. But Trotsky just lies so much. His word is really worth nothing. And I discovered that writing that book, Trotsky's Amalgams, and then updating it somewhat and abbreviating, only taking part of it out in that book, Trotsky's Lies. Now, since then, I've written, I think it's 3 more books about Trotsky. And there I have drawn upon documents from the former Soviet archives, more and more of which are being made public in one way or another. Okay.
Right.
Now, the issue there is that people who are into denial are going to say, well, these are Soviet sources, so, maybe they're fraudulent. Maybe the NKVD forced people to falsely confess against Trotsky, or maybe they forged evidence against Trotsky. This is Soviet evidence. And there's 2 responses to that. Well, there's more than 2, but let me just give you 2. One is, these are documents which are never intended for publication. So what would be the purpose in falsifying? Secondly, the best known Trotskyist historian in the world, I guess, is the late Vadim Rogovin. His works are being translated to English. He wrote like 8 books in Russian. He died, I think, in 1999, something like that. But he's a very famous Trotskyist historian, Russian Trotskyist historian. He uses Soviet sources almost exclusively. So the idea, that it's somehow or other illegitimate or suspect to use Soviet sources is an argument that's used very selectively. It's used maybe against me, but it isn't used against people who are, anti-Stalin, who are pro-Trotsky. It's just used when they want to deny. And that brings up the issue of the lack of objectivity. Very, very few people who are writing about Soviet history try to be objective. That is, try to question their own preconceived ideas, and they fall afoul of that logical fallacy that I mentioned a few moments ago called the confirmation bias. There's a pretty good article in Wikipedia on confirmation bias. So really what it means is the tendency to give more weight to sources that appear to confirm your own preconceived ideas and prejudices, and the tendency to give less weight or to dismiss those sources that appear to challenge your own preconceived ideas. And in the hard sciences and the natural sciences and the social sciences, there are scholars take definite steps in order to try to maintain objectivity, in order that their own personal biases will not distort or predetermine their results. But in the field of Soviet history, almost nobody does that. Okay, so therefore, their preconceived ideas, Stalin was bad, and he was a dictator, and he was a mass murderer, and all this kind of stuff, and just get confirmed because of the confirmation bias. They never really tried to be objective, which means even if they stumbled across the truth, they wouldn't recognize it. They wouldn't know what it is. And they're not looking for the truth. They're looking for anything that might prop up their own preconceived anti-Stalin ideas. And again, this is shameful. And on the one hand, on the other hand, the people who do this, the scholars who do this, on the one hand, they do it because it's the only way to succeed in that field. If you don't adhere to the anti-Stalin paradigm, you're not going to be able to have a career in the field of Soviet history, right? You're not going to be able to get published. You're not going to be able to get tenure. You're not going to be able to have a job. It's expected that you will fit whatever you're doing into the anti-Stalin paradigm. The second is that if you question this paradigm, as I do, you're really asking people to question the whole way that they look at Soviet history and world history. And they're unlikely to do that just because one scholar, no matter how careful that scholar is, let's say it's me, just because one scholar says this is what we must do. It's just too much. Noam Chomsky, who unfortunately is a very powerful communist, mainly because he doesn't know much about it. But he's also a powerful critic of American imperialism. Sure. And he has said on various occasions that it takes much more to challenge a paradigm in history than it does to support that paradigm. And of course, he's challenging the paradigm that the United States is a force for freedom, democracy in the world.
Right.
And showing that the opposite is the case, but it's very hard to do that because you're constantly challenging people's preconceived ideas, and it's very hard to get people to move beyond their preconceived ideas. And one more thing about that. Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf in the second book of Mein Kampf, has a couple of sections on what he calls the big lie.
Right.
And the big lie is, the idea of the big lie is you say what's in your interest, not without regard to the truth. And you repeat it over and over again from different sources and from different experts, but mainly you repeat it over and over again. And most people will end up believing you because they can't imagine themselves acting that way. And therefore, they can't imagine that others, particularly people in authority whom one is supposed to respect, can't imagine that they will behave that way. So the big lie is very effective, says Hitler. And of course, he was correct. And that's what's going on in the history of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period. It's the big lie. It's repeated over and over again. And people have heard that Stalin is this monster so many times that 99% of people couldn't give you a citation if they were challenged, right? It's just what everybody knows. It's like the Holodomor. Okay. Right. Ukrainian nationalists invented this false notion of a deliberate famine in Ukraine. It's completely false. It happens to be, actually, that not a single, even anti-communist historian in the West accepts the story of the Holodomor. For example, Kotkin doesn't accept it.
Oh, wow.
Okay?
Yeah.
Kotkin, well, I mean, Timothy Snyder accepts it, but Timothy Snyder is not a scholar of the Soviet Union. He repeats what the Ukrainian nationalists and the Polish nationalists, liars, tell him. But even Kotkin doesn't accept it. Kotkin blames the famine on Stalin, but he doesn't. But he explicitly says it wasn't a Holodomor; it was deliberate. Kotkin's wrong about that too. But he doesn't accept the Holodomor. No legitimated anti-communist Western source accepts the notion of the Holodomor. But the Ukrainian nationalists were not interested. They were interested in leapfrogging over academia and getting to the popular and semi-popular press.
Right.
And, of course, to brainwashing the Ukrainian population. That's the most important thing. And they've succeeded in doing that, right? There are articles, people refer to the Holodomor, in newspaper articles and magazine articles and so forth all the time. And what they're doing is they've simply accepted this is in the air, and they're repeating it. There's no evidence for it, and they couldn't give you any evidence for it. But as long as you say, as long as you can get it into the mass media, then what the academics have to say really is not even significant. Nobody's gonna look at that. So you hear about this. So this is what's going on. It's almost like that movie, The Matrix. Where you're living in this phony universe. When it comes to Soviet history, you're living in this phony universe. I don't know if I answered your question. I guess I sort of roamed around there.
No, I think you did, and there's a lot there. And something comes up for me right now, and I didn't preface this question when I sent it over. It's just occurring to me in the moment, and I don't know if you even are able to answer this, but so I'm aware of certain efforts made by the United States government to recruit Nazi soldiers after World War I, known as Operation Paperclip, and of course that led
World
to
War II.
Yeah, I'm sorry. After World War II, so they recruited Nazi scientists that comprised our rocket systems, that eventually, all that stuff, right? But I was under the impression there wasn't a USSR equivalent of that, meaning that after World War II, there weren't Nazi scientists that were recruited by the USSR. But folks have pointed me towards a different, I can't pronounce it. I'm not sure what it's called, but it's an operation something in Russia that was like the Russian equivalent of Operation Paperclip. Have you encountered that in your research? And is there any truth to that at all?
I know I haven't done. I've only really researched the 1930s. Say the late 20s through the 30s. So I haven't researched.
Okay.
I would be surprised if the Soviets didn't try to recruit some scientists from Germany or from the Axis countries. I don't know why they wouldn't try, but I'd be surprised if they got very many, because most of those people wanted to come west, of course.
Right.
They, especially if they had any kind of history of collaboration with the Nazis, because there was always the danger that they would be prosecuted very severely. It is certainly true that in Western Europe, and including West Germany, but also Western Europe and even the United States and Canada, the Allies recruited many former Nazis, many Nazis who were guilty of enormous crimes,
right.
Adolf Eichmann type stuff, because some of them either might prove useful in the struggle against communism or had already become expert in the anti-communist struggle. That was the case with the Ukrainian nationalist fascists. They were, up until, I guess, 1990 or so, a number of them were living in Queens, New York. Mass murderers, being supported by the American government, probably through the CIA funding and so forth, to smuggle propaganda into the Soviet Union. The United States certainly was supporting Ukrainian nationalist terrorists and also Polish nationalist terrorists in those countries right after World War II, for some period of time after World War II, dropping them supplies. I don't think that worked very well. I think a lot of the times the Soviets or the pro-Soviet Poles had agents in the Western Allies who reported on them. These efforts were undermined, but you're talking about Western support for real Nazi murderers, and there was a lot of that. That's for sure, and there's been quite a bit written about that.
Sure.
The South, you don't live in New Jersey, but I live in New Jersey. In South River, New Jersey, which is a town basically, formerly a working class town in central New Jersey, was the settling area for white Russian, Belarusian nationalists, many of whom were Nazi collaborators. Patterson, New Jersey, which is just a few miles over here from Montclair State, where I teach, was an area where some Turkic peoples from the Soviet Union who had collaborated with the Nazis were settled, and there was some sort of minor uproar about that back in the 1980s. One of the leaders of this Turkic community that had been founded by these Nazi collaborators was assassinated, and there was a lot of talk. It was in newspapers and so forth. Maybe the Jewish Defense League killed him. I don't think it was ever pinned successfully on anybody. But yeah, there was a lot of support of Eastern European and Soviet Nazis and Nazi collaborators in the West, for sure.
So one more question off the top of my head here. Have you found any evidence of Stalin being anti-Semitic within your research?
No, well, I mean no, I haven't.
Okay.
I have a whole chapter in Blood Lies. Timothy Snyder's, horrifically dishonest book, Bloodlands, which is still widely won a number of prizes, was translated into 28 languages, widely celebrated, a completely dishonest work. He says the subtitle of this book is Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. So Hitler, of course, committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. So you'd think that the book would stop there, but the book doesn't stop there. He's got another chapter. Another chapter about what? About Stalin's anti-Semitism.
Oh my God.
Well, that's what it's about, And now that already contradicts the title of the book. This is not between Hitler and Stalin anymore because Hitler's dead.
Right.
Now it's just about Stalin, which is his real aim all along, of course. And I have a chapter in my book where I show that he's. I say he's lying. It's hard to draw. It's hard to draw the line sometimes between deliberate lying and simple incompetence. Maybe the tendency to tell anti-Stalin stories and to cherry pick, that kind of stuff because it agrees with your preconceived idea here, can be so strong that it can lead you to just not know anymore or not care anymore what good evidence is and what it isn't. So I assume he was lying, but maybe he was just repeating maybe it was just the confirmation bias, just repeating any old story that seemed to claim that Stalin was anti-Semitic, although there's a couple of statements in there that have to be lies because they're not in anybody else's source, so he must have made them up. But but I think the impulse is clear. The reason for that chapter is if you're going to compare Hitler and Stalin, of course, that's a big ideological goal of anti-Stalin, publications,
Right.
is to equate Stalin, communism and fascism, Stalin, Hitler, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, this totalitarian, the whole bogus concept of totalitarianism is completely fraudulent concept. But so he's doing this, because, if you're really going to compare Stalin to Hitler, then we've got to show that Stalin was anti-Semitic. So then, of course, I show that anybody who seriously looks into this subject shows that that his chapter is completely dishonest. But he's drawing upon a lot of other dishonest stuff which is out there and which makes it into the popular and semi-popular press, and people read about it, so people think it's true. And you run across this all the time. I was reading 2 days ago. Nothing to do. There's a big snowstorm. I know you guys know how to deal with that. I came originally from Montreal, Canada, so
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Snowstorm we had was everybody deals. Nobody misses work because 14 inches of snow fall down. But in New Jersey they do. So I was sitting at home. New Jersey is sitting at home reading stuff. So somebody, not unlike yourself, I guess, emails me. So Mark, and what do you think about this guy Eric Dreitzer, who writes for Counterpunch? Now, Counterpunch is, I guess, legitimately considered to be a left-wing source. Okay, a left-wing journal. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So people consider that left-wing, but it's very strongly, on the rare occasions when the subject comes up, it's very strongly anti-Stalin. Okay, it just doesn't come up much. Kind of like Noam Chomsky. Doesn't talk about communism much. When he does, it's all nonsense. But fortunately, he doesn't do it much. Well, Counterpunch. So Counterpunch has this guy who's been writing for it quite a bit. He's an older man, in his 80s, named Eric Dreitzer, who was born in the Soviet Union. So somebody was asking me about him. I said, I don't even know anything about it. I'll see what's available online. I'm sitting there with nothing to do really at home on my cell phone. Now I found this chapter from his autobiography. Autobiography is called Shush. Something like, the lives of Jews in the Soviet Union under Stalin, something like that. Anyway, Shush. So, I found a chapter of this online and downloaded it. And, this guy's repeating all of this Stalin was an anti-Semite type stuff, which may very well be that he heard this stuff when he was a kid in the Soviet Union. And certainly he's heard some of it since, it's been repeated. But we know that all the stuff that he mentions is just false. Okay, but he's never bothered to check it. He's never bothered to go and look into sources. He never bothered to say, gee, I wrote that stuff in my autobiography. And now we could go back, and of course he's Russian. He could easily go back and check to see if these things that he was told and that he repeats, he could check to see if they're true or not. But, that's beneath him, right? I mean, if he heard it when he was 15 years old because his uncle told him, then there it goes. Into the autobiography it goes. And it's anti-Stalin, of course, but it's nonsense. All of this stuff can be disproven. And it has been disproven. And a number of these things are in that last chapter of Blood Lies that I wrote. So, Stalin was not an anti-Semite. In fact, in 2003, I think, Joris Medvedev. Have you ever heard of him?
I have not, no.
Okay, well, there's a guy named Roy Medvedev, who's a little bit better known because he wrote a book called Let History Judge in English translation, back in the 60s. Roy Medvedev, who's, by the way, the Medvedev brothers are still alive. They're in the 90s, well into.
Wow.
I think Roy Medvedev must be 96 now, something like that. But in any case, Roy Medvedev was putting together this big pseudo-historical book attacking Stalin, And then suddenly Khrushchev was removed, was kicked out by Brezhnev and company. And Medvedev's book wasn't ready. So he didn't finish it for another couple of years. And by that time, Brezhnev, who obviously knew better, decided he wasn't going to publish it. So he Medvedev smuggled this book to the West, and it was partially translated as Let History Judge, and made this big splash. Of course, it's full of anti-Stalin stuff, all of which is false. You go back and read that book. It's 900 pages long. It's like, we can disprove everything.
Yeah,
okay.
wow.
Like a litany of Khrushchev-era lies about Stalin, but it's accepted as this great source. Anyway, he had a brother. He has a brother named Jaurès. He's named after M.N. Roy, who was his father was a communist. The Medvedev's brother's father was a communist. So he named one son after M.N. Roy, who was a famous Indian communist in the 1920s. And the other brother was named Jaurès after Jean Jaurès, who was the leader of the French socialists up until he was assassinated in 1914. Anyway, so Jaurès Medvedev was a scientist, been living in England and the UK for a long time. He wrote this book called Stalin and the Jewish Question. This is in 2003. And he does this in response to some books that had come out in Russia, accusing Stalin of being, anti-Semitic. And Jaurès Medvedev is very well respected. His brother's very well respected. They were dissidents, during the Soviet years. They're certainly not at all pro-Stalin in any sense. The Jaurès Medvedev's book is very interesting. It's in Russian only. It's about 200 pages long. And when it came out, I got it. And I read it. And he says in there, he has a lot of stuff, but one of the things he says is that Stalin was not anti-Semitic. Here's the way he puts it. He says Stalin's anti-Semitism was limited to his being anti-Zionist.
Okay.
Well, Stalin was anti-Zionist, that's for sure. So Medvedev is very careful here, and he's not saying now to be anti-Zionist is not to be anti-Semite. That's what I would say. Maybe that's what a lot of people would say. Okay, to be anti-Zionist is not to be anti-Semitic. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, so therefore he doesn't really say Stalin wasn't an anti-Semite. What he says is Stalin's anti-Semitism was limited to his being an anti-Zionist. In other respects, he wasn't anti-Semitic. And one of the interesting things he says in that book is that Stalin didn't have Mikhails, who was this a Yiddish theater director who was killed in 1948, ostensibly in an automobile accident. Solomon Mikhails, Jaurès Medvedev says Stalin didn't have him murdered. I don't believe it. Now that's like taken for granted in Soviet history that Stalin had Solomon Mikhails murdered. Even Stalin's daughter, Svetlana, says it at one point. But there's no evidence. There's no evidence at all that that's the case. And here, Jaurès Medvedev is saying, I don't believe it. So it's a very interesting book. Now, nobody ever quotes that book for that reason, probably. But no, Stalin was. I have the quotations in that chapter of Blood Lies. If you take a look at it, there's lots of evidence that Stalin was not. Let's put it this way: there's lots of evidence that Stalin was not anti-Semitic. I have some quotes in there, and there's also it's easy to refute those stories that are related by not only by Snyder but by others that he's cribbing from. Those stories that Stalin was an anti-Semite. It's easy to refute those if you look up the sources, right? But again, what's the point of doing that? Why would you do that? Why would you endanger, if you're in the field of Soviet studies, why would you endanger your reputation? Why would you get anti-communists angry at you by doing that, right? By saying that Stalin was not an anti-Semite. Of course, Jaurès Medvedev has nothing to fear, right? He's not only a senior guy, he has impeccable anti-Soviet or at least anti-Stalin, dissident credentials. So he can just be ignored. Just ignore his book. We'll never cite it. But no, Stalin was anti-Semitic. But these stories get repeated over and over again, and And this guy, Eric Dreitzer, repeats them, right? Why bother to check up? I mean, they make such great anti-Stalin stories. Why ruin it by going out there and checking and maybe finding out that maybe they're not true?
Yeah.
You know? I've been
Yeah.
kind of rain on my parade here. So I'm not going to do that, right? I'm not going to go there. Let's just accept it. Okay. Let's just, it's kind of like the Western scholars and propagandists generally took Khrushchev's speech. But why agree that, why think that Khrushchev is telling the truth? I mean, if it was Stalin giving a speech, would you think that he was telling the truth? Why think that Khrushchev is telling the truth? Why accept it? Well, because it's just too good to pass up. You know, it's like they're giving us this present. You know, here's the head of the Communist Party saying that the whole communist movement was led by a pathological murderer during its greatest years, right? I mean, why question that, right? In the war against communism, this is a great gift. Why look a gift horse in the mouth?
Right.
So there you go. That's
Right.
the field of Soviet studies.
Well, thank you for clearing that up. You know, it's something that I'm surprised I didn't think about asking you that question before I sent stuff over. But yeah, there's one other. I guess I have one more question. That's really two questions here. Because a lot of comrades online really want to know if there was actual evidence of Trotsky collaborating with the Germans. And of course, you have an essay called Evidence of Trotsky's Collaboration with Germany and Japan. So in what way does your essay, The Evidence of Trotsky's Collaboration with Germany and Japan, does it relate to your newest book about the how am I pronouncing this? Tukuchevsky affair?
Sure. Well, I got... That essay is like 2010. Okay.
Right.
Well, I would. So it's out of date. Okay. We have a lot more stuff. A lot. I mean, there was stuff then, but we have a lot more. So a few years ago, I wrote a book called Leon Trotsky's Collaboration with Germany and Japan, which is not just an expansion, but has a lot more evidence. And then I wrote published another book called New Evidence of Trotsky's Conspiracy. And then in this book, I have the one that just came out, Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy. There's a lot in that book about Trotsky's relationship and Trotsky's collaboration with Marshal Tukuchevsky and the other military commanders who were tried and executed in June 1937. We now have the transcript of the trial. As of 2018, we have the transcript of the trial. It was declassified. There's a fascinating story about that because my colleague Vladimir Bobrov and one of his colleagues in Russia have been trying to get that transcript for 20 years, and they were never able to successfully get it. And then suddenly in May 2018, without any fanfare, without any announcement, it was handed to first one and then a little later to another online site to just publish it, just put it online.
Wow.
And so we have Sten Erik Holmstrom, a wonderful co-author in Sweden, translated that entire trial transcript, 172 pages in Russian, into English, and we publish it in this book. And one of the chapters in this book is titled, let me just give you the exact title, Trotsky in the Transcript of the Tukuchevsky Affair Trial, because these 8 military high commanders, all of whom confessed in very interesting and complicated ways to being guilty. They certainly implicated themselves and many other people too, and each other. They all talked about their experience with Trotsky's collaboration, their knowledge of it. Tukuchevsky was directly in touch with Trotsky and Trotsky's son, Leon Sedov. There's a great deal of evidence of that. And I have an article that, so there's that. I published an article a year and a half ago or so about Trotsky and the Spanish Civil War. It's on my webpage. My homepage is easy enough to find online, and it's towards the top because it's one of the more recent articles. You download that. And there, what I show is that the Soviets, Stalin and company, did not really start the hunt after Trotskyists until two things had happened. Number one, the Barcelona May Days revolt of 1937, which the Trotskyists were involved in, but the Nazis were also involved in. This is the revolt that stabbed the Spanish Republic in the back during.
Oh my God! Wow.
War. Yeah, that's the Barcelona May Days, 1937. Wow. And I discussed that. It was the evidence of that both the Trotskyists and the Nazis were involved in that, and of course the Spanish fascists. And then that was the beginning of May, and then in the beginning of June, the Tukuchevsky, where these commanders go into great detail about Trotsky's collaboration with Germany and with themselves. They were collaborating with him. They were collaborating with Germany. Trotsky was collaborating with Germany. Trotsky was collaborating with them, all to assassinate Soviet leaders, stab the Red Army in the back, open the borders to Germany and or Japan should they invade. Trotsky was counting on a war that the Soviet Union would be invaded by these fascist powers, and then hoped to come to power as a result of a military coup led by these commanders. There's lots of evidence, both Soviet evidence and non-Soviet evidence, that this was the case, and we go into all of that in this book, Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy. So there's a tremendous amount of evidence that Trotsky was collaborating with the Germans and the Japanese. In a future book on Trotsky, I have more evidence of his collaboration with the Japanese.
Wow.
But and who knows what might come out between now and then. But certainly the Trotskyists and certainly mainstream Soviet historians are simply going to ignore this stuff because it completely overturns the apple cart of the anti-Stalin paradigm. Once you accept that the charges made against the defendants in the Moscow show trials, so-called, the 36, 37, and 38, including Trotsky, who he and his son they were indicted, but they were not present, right? They were there.
Right.
So, once you see that the charges made by the Soviets against these defendants, and certainly against Trotsky, are very well substantiated by evidence that we now have from the Soviet archives, and some evidence from outside the former Soviet archives too, outside the Soviet Union. Then the whole paradigm, the anti-Stalin paradigm, is overthrown, and our whole model, the whole demonized model of Soviet history and during the Stalin period of Stalin himself is, you have to junk that, and they're not going to do that. They're just not. Right. It's not going. So it'll be ignored or poo-pooed, or somebody will say, or people will say, oh well, maybe the Soviets fabricated all of this stuff, but there never was any evidence that the defendants of the Moscow trials were innocent. There never was any evidence that Trotsky was innocent of these things. He denied it, but of course we expect, in the normal course of events, we expect both the guilty and the innocent to deny guilt, right?
Right.
When somebody's arrested for a crime, whether they're guilty or not, we expect them to deny it. Now, sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes the guilty confess to being guilty right away. But normally, the fact that a person who's accused of a crime declares that he's innocent is really not of any probative value, right?
Right.
So one of my focuses in my more recent books and articles has been Trotskyism, which is, I think, a real leaden weight around the neck of the left around the world. There was never any evidence that Trotsky was telling the truth. The Soviets always had the evidence that was set forth in the transcripts of the Moscow trials, all of which were readily available. So why would you believe Trotsky's proclamations of innocence when, of course, he couldn't prove he was innocent? And why would you doubt the evidence that the Soviets had put forward? At the time. I mean, you had to have powerful motivations to do that. So there's never been any evidence that Trotsky was this great principled revolutionary who was innocent of all the charges that were leveled against him and so forth. And there's far, far more evidence of his guilt now that, I've published these books, and there's probably lots more still to be published. But it's not going to that. The truth is not going to it's not going to convince the convinced Trotskyists and the convinced anti-communists. And it's unmentionable in the field of Soviet studies. I've been told by two, reputable scholars in the field of Soviet studies of the Stalin period, the people who talk with me, I'm in good terms with them, been told twice, independently, that Grover, you have to say bad things about Stalin. You got to say something bad about Stalin. You're not going to be believed if you don't say something bad about Stalin. Your work isn't going to be accepted. So they understand it. They don't call it the Anti-Stalin Paradigm, but that's what it is.
Right.
You have to say this. And of course, if you want to have a career in that field, you do. I'm not in that field. I teach literature. So I don't care. I'm not really even writing for those people. I'm not writing for the people who teach Soviet history around the world, right?
Right.
Because I know that this is unacceptable to them. But there are many, many people around the world, such as yourself, and many, many others, many, many countries, who really genuinely want to know the truth.
Absolutely.
And I do. And that's my target. That's who I am writing for. And I think that in the long run, it might be a long time or maybe not, but in the long term, I think the truth will prevail.
Well, Dr. Furr, it has been such an honor and a privilege to talk to you. There's so much within this conversation. I'm sure that a lot of my comrades that I know will definitely listen to the show and take things from it that are valuable to them, that inform their sense of true history, not the narrative of history, which has been promulgated by anti-communists and proponents of U.S. imperialism. And I just so appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Before we let you go, would you be able to tell us where our listeners can find your work online, and tell us how they can obtain a copy of your newest work?
Sure. Okay, I have a homepage, and if you Google Grover Furr homepage, it'll come up. And all of my articles, all the articles I've ever been involved in writing, either by myself or with Vladimir Bobrov, can all be downloaded there. All of the books, except for this latest one, which I haven't had a chance to put up yet on my homepage, that is the Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy. All of my books are listed there. And you can get them all from Amazon.com, or you can get them from the publishers, who are also, the links to them are also listed there. Or, of course, you could just Google the titles of the books themselves, and they will come up. So with the internet, it's all very accessible. But certainly, if you were to go to Amazon, just to take an example, and type in Grover Furr, I think every single one of my books comes up. You can get most of them from me or from my publishers. Amazon takes a big cut every time you buy a book through Amazon. Amazon takes $6. So if you really want it to be supportive, you could buy it from my publisher. He'll make a little bit of money. My publishers have to make something. This is really a labor of love, but they also have expenses, so they have to cover them. I don't make any money on books. I don't do it for money. And I don't make any money, and that's fine. I'm just trying to investigate this very important period in world history, the Stalin period in the Soviet Union, and I hope to continue to do that. And yes, certainly, that's one way that your listeners can find out about my works, and they can also find my email on the internet very easily, and they can contact me, and I'll reply to them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Furr. I just so appreciate it. And I hope you're faring well this semester, starting out teaching again in person. Like I said, I hope you stay healthy. I hope that everything goes well for you this semester. And I can't wait to read some of the transcript that's only available in that book. And and I'll definitely, if I have any further questions, I will send them to you. I hope that you'll be a friend of the show and return later on when more questions emerge. And like I said, I think that there are a lot of listeners that will take a lot of value from our conversation. So I can't thank you enough. And it's really been my privilege and honor.
Thank you very much for inviting me. So it's an honor for me as well. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, that's it for episode 20 of No Easy Answers. As always, check out the show notes for more ways you can join the conversation. We have links to our Reddit, our Patreon, our Discord. As always, send your comments, concerns, criticisms, or vitriol to noeasyanswerspodcast@gmail.com. Support for No Easy Answers comes from listeners just like you. So if you've not done so already, please consider becoming a supporter of the podcast by heading to patreon.com/noeasyanswers. Until next time, take care, all my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. See ya.